Welcome everyone to our panel of superintendents from throughout Deschutes County. Each of them has prepared about 5 minutes of remarks about the challenges and successes within their respective school districts. And then they'll be fielding questions from the audience for about 45 minutes. When I initially solicited some questions from our members who are educators, I have a list now of about 25 questions. They have all of those questions, and feel free to ask any questions once it's opened up for questions. First on your left is Dr. Stephen Cook. Starting his third year as the superintendent of schools, Dr. Stephen Cook has made a significant impact on the education system in the area. Originally from Kansas, he has worked in various locations such as Colorado and Idaho before working in Bend LaPine schools. Dr. Cook has devoted his life to public education with well over 30 years of experience as a teacher, building administrator, and district leader. In the middle is Dr. Charan. Cline is completing his third year as the superintendent of the Redmond School District. He spent 6 years as a high school social studies teacher, 3 years as a high school assistant principal, 4 years as a middle school principal, 2 years as a director of school improvement and special education at an ESD, 2 years as a part-time assistant superintendent at the same ESD. The other half of his assignment was being the superintendent of a very small school district. He then spent 8 years as a superintendent in another district. He has 28 years of experience in public schools. On your far right is Curtis Scholl. He came to the sister school district in the summer of 2015 from the Salem-Keizer School District. Prior to his work in the Salem-Keizer district, Scholl was an assistant principal at West Lynn High School for 3 years and principal at Vernonia High School for 3 years. While working in West Lynn, Wilsonville, he attended Harvard University Principal's Corner and was recognized as a teacher of excellence. Scholl has worked in the classroom as a social studies teacher for 6 years and also handled coaching duties for football and baseball. Scholl has a master's degree in science and is teaching from Portland State University and a Bachelor of Arts from History from Linfield College and is currently working on his doctorate. So I will first welcome Dr. Cook to make some opening remarks.
Thank you, Charan. Well, first of all, thank you so much for allowing us the time to be here. We know each other very well, so we may kid one another. I didn't realize Kurt until just now that he was a baseball coach. So thank you. We're glad to be here. I'm Steve Cook. I'm superintendent of Bend LaPine Schools. Just closing out year 2, beginning to start planning for year 3. Just a little bit about Bend LaPine Schools. We have 33 schools in Bend LaPine School District. We service about just under 18,000 students. We have about 30 languages spoken in our district. That's a shock to people sometimes, and it tends to drive a lot of our decision making because we tended to think of our schools kind of almost monolithically, and I can assure you with our 33 schools, they're very different worlds from each other. About 81% of our students identify as Caucasian, 19% of our students identify in some other either multi-ethnic, African American. Our largest minority population is Latino population. And we have about 8% of our students are English language learners. And so we have a large population. When you do the math on that, that's over 1,000 students that are coming to us as second language English speakers. And so we talk a lot about how are we going to ensure that all students feel welcomed and they feel a sense of belonging when they come to our schools. I'm sure we're going to go into more detail with this later, but I can tell you right now, one of the questions Charan's asked us to present on in these first initial minutes was, what are some of our most immediate challenges and what are some of our most prevalent successes? This, like I said, I'm just closing out my second year, and so my first year was halfway through the pandemic. So the fact that we we made it through school. We didn't have to close any schools, I would tell you, is a success. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the pandemic is a once in a lifetime kind of upheaval of the educational process and the way public education was being delivered and being perceived in the community. It's the very first time that there was an absolute look into, from the community, parents, guardians, you name it. They got to see what was going on. And I think some of that was for the better, because it's pushing us into a different way of thinking. And we're coming out of this with lots of cathartic kinds of energy. And so when you ask about success, this is a success in progress. The fact that it's like the lobster shell coming off. We're going to have a better public educational process as we come out of this, and that kind of change is iterative and it's adaptive. It's deeply challenging work. I can tell you that I don't get anything easy on my desk ever. What we're working on right now are going to set the trajectory for public school in the years to come. And mark my words, I'm a lifetime public educator, started in the 80s. This is some of the most important work I've ever been a part of. It's it's 1 step forward, 5 steps back, 2 steps forward, 12 steps back. It is big, heavy lift. I would tell you that's the biggest success. The second thing I would tell you that is our biggest success right now is the value of quality teaching has never been a higher priority in our school system. We have about 2,400 employees. Our budget's about just under $220 million. We are the second largest employer in all of Central Oregon. I can tell you that a quality instructor makes all the difference in the world for kids. I will also tell you that my biggest challenge is the fact that right now my best paid teachers can't afford to live in this community. And I'm not saying that for any other reason that I've got to solve that problem. We have got to solve that problem. This community has to own that together, and we've got to fix that. It is, and they'll tell you the same thing. This isn't just us. Median price in Burns, $168,000. You could buy a middle of the road house in Burns, $680,000 here. Guess how much a starting pay for a teacher in Burns is? About $44,000. Guess how much a starting pay for a teacher in Ben Lapine and Redmond and Sisters? Somewhere around $43,000. Like, that's an equity issue any way you cut it. So when you ask me what my challenges are, that's my number one challenge. I would also tell you I have 3 grown kids, 33, 32, 29. Not one of them are in public education. Not one of them. And by the way, nobody leaves here today without filling out a substitute teaching form for us. You're not going to be able to come to the meetings after this because you're going to be busy in one of our 3 districts filling in, because it's a tough gig out there right now. Public education is under fire, and I would ask you to stand up with us. I'm not afraid. Greg is a good example. I'm not afraid to be pushed. Not one of us is afraid to be challenged with thoughtful conversation, dialogue, you name it. We have faced all kinds of problems. I promise you we'll engage you in those conversations, but I can tell you that this is not ours to own. We rent these job titles. We need these communities to stand up and fight for public education, because it is a tough gig right now. And the fact that my 3 kids who went through high school during the No Child Left Behind era, they talk about what it was like for them when they reminisce. I mean, they're in their 30s. When they reminisce, they talk about their extracurricular activities, and all they remember is getting tested at the wazoo. They got 1 year. I counted my oldest son, middle child. He had 64 tests 1 year, and that's his experience. That's what he remembers, and so he would be right in the middle of his 10th or 11th year of teaching right now, had he chosen that pathway. And when I asked him about it, he's like, whatever, not a chance. And so I don't want to talk down on our profession. I've given everything I have to this profession. I would just beg that this community understand and know that it is in all of our best interest to make sure that we are fighting for what we need in public education. Thank you.
Well, as always, Steve covered a lot of the issues head up, and I appreciate that because it's always hard to follow in the situation. But he's right. What we need to do about public education and what we need to do to build strong communities. One of the things that COVID really proved to us was, at least to me, and I think a lot of folks, is just how powerful public education is, and just how important it is for our students and their growth and their development. Before the pandemic, lots and lots of online schools were out there, and the conversation was, hey, are online schools going to take over schools? Are they going to make the brick and mortar plant irrelevant? Well, we had a chance to try that during the pandemic, and we found no, actually, it's really a problem when kids aren't building relationships with each other, they're not building relationships with their teachers, and they're not doing really that social development. Talking about some of the challenges in Redmond schools, and we talk about these things a lot. It's interesting how much the pandemic impacted the growth and development of kids, how much they matured during that time period. I have high school principals complaining that their freshman class acts like they're all seventh graders. I have our middle school principals complaining that they're sixth graders, and they come in and they don't know how to do even basic interaction with each other, and because of that, they're a little more violent than they used to be, because that's how they know how to solve problems. We've had some interesting challenges, and I would say that part of our success at the Redmond School District is that we focused all year this year on renorming, teaching both teachers and students what it is to work together again. How does that process happen? How does that work happen? And that's been a huge emphasis for us. We've had lots and lots of issues. We have had lots and lots of people calling in threats and all sorts of things that have happened. But really, it's been very much this year about continuing to say, what is it to operate as part of a whole group of people? So for those of you that don't know the Redmond schools, we're about 7,100 students in 13 schools and one charter school. Really a neat little district. We serve Redmond, all the way down to Alfalfa and Tumalo, out to Terrebonne, out to Crooked River Ranch. We even have a little piece of us that's in Jefferson County, but most of us is in that Deschutes County area. The town of Redmond is growing like crazy. However, the school district is not. We're finding is that people, young people, are not having as many children as they once did. We're finding that folks that move into our area and would like to have kids have a hard time affording a house, have a hard time saying, I've got enough money to have an apartment and raise a couple kids. People are making decisions to have lower amounts of children because of that. It's one of the reasons. And it's an interesting situation. You would think that we would be growing. We just did a population survey and found out that we really could expect to have about 500 new kids over the next 10 years. That's a fairly flat growth rate, for as much as Central Oregon is just growing like crazy and people are moving over here and they want to move over here. So that's an interesting challenge we have. What do we do with our facilities? What do we do with our spaces over time? How do we build for the future when you're not quite sure how many students you've got as you're going through that? How do we recruit for teachers, and how do we get the best ones? We don't have a problem recruiting for teachers right now in Central Oregon. We did last year with the pandemic. It's hard for people to move around. I can tell you that we have, for every one of our elementary positions, 50 applicants. We had 6 great applicants for our one of our advanced math positions, and those folks are like panning for gold to try and find a good advanced math teacher. The only place we're really having a lot of trouble recruiting folks happens to be in secondary special ed. Special education continues to be quite a challenge for us. We have a lot of students that come to us who have significant disabilities, and that has upgraded a lot during the pandemic. Talking about our student population, about 25% of our students are Latinx. Most of the rest are white, and then we have a mixture of kind of a variety of races. We have about 20 different languages spoken in our district, quite a group of newcomers that have come in. We have a great second language program in one of our elementary schools, dual language program, excuse me, and that's moving up into one of our middle schools next year. We're very excited about that work. What if you asked a question about our schools in chaos? Because we see that in the news sometimes. I can tell you, no, not really. We have some chaotic students. Right now we are drowning in autism. Autism is coming into us in dramatic sense. Early intervention right now, we have 15 students stacked up with autism ready to come into our school district. Now we're about 1/3 the size of Bend. They have 5 stacked up. So for whatever reason, we're attracting a lot of students into Redmond, kind of with those issues. So we're having to build new programs, we're having to recruit new people, we're having to develop expertise we've never had before. It's important work, it's really important work, we're glad to do it. Public education builds community, it builds what we try and do. My approach as a public educator, and as I was mentioned, Charan mentioned earlier, I've been doing this about 28 years, all in the state of Oregon. Kind of my personal vision is to use public education to build communities. And I think about my work not just as an educator, but as a community servant. And so in every school that I've worked in, even when I was back as a social studies teacher, the idea was, how do I get kids out in the community? How do I get parents? How do I get families into my schools? And that's a really important part of work that we do, because we're not just a school. We are the largest employers in Redmond. And for my aspect, we have a responsibility to help that town become a better place to live. And that's an important piece of our work. So how do we outreach? How do we bring people in? I could talk forever. I can just tell you real quick, we've got 13 schools as we go through. I mentioned that. We also have online programs we work with students. We have behavioral programs. We have a wide range of things that we do for students. We've got about 10 career tech ed programs. One of the questions I often get in these kind of forums are, what are you doing for kids who don't want to go to college? Or, I don't know why kids need to go to college. Or, it's too expensive. I hear this a lot. And we do a good job of getting kids ready for college that want to go there. We also have these 10 programs that help students think about, what else could I do with myself? And they're oftentimes then go to tech schools. You know, in my view of things, we have kids that go off to engineering schools, or they get out and they go work on a manufacturing floor if that's where they're at. We try and help kids be ready for whatever they want to go. So I've randomly rattled off quite a bit. I'm going to turn this over to Kurt. Thank you.
Well, thank you. First, start off, thanks for the invite. It's always nice to get out and talk about what we do to support schools. I'm proud of the work that we're doing in Sisters. So we are the smallest district represented here today. So we have total in our district about 1,170 students. We have 3 schools. We have an elementary, a middle school, and a high school. We have a very supportive community. We have passed a local option that supports education for the last 25 years, just renewed. For us, that creates more money. We target that money for small class sizes and special programming. So if you come to Sisters, you get to potentially get your personal private pilot's license before you graduate high school, or you can build a guitar in the luthier program. We've actually expanded to be able to build skis and snowboards in our classes. We have a culinary program. We have a partnership with St. Charles to do a pre-med internship where kids can do some rounds in hospitals we used to have a personal training program, but we're pivoting on that a little bit. Culinary arts. We have really small class sizes. Our elementary school, we're about 1 to 19 or 18. So we put the money that our community supports us with into things we said we would, which are small class sizes and unique programming. Part of that unique programming also is, we have a board that says, how do we do it? Not should we do it? Our kids we have a class called Individual Environmental Exploration. So our kids will go spend 2 nights on the South Sister and study the environment. Actually, this weekend, they're on the Deschutes River, rafting down in the Deschutes River. And I'm a parent of 4, 3 of which are already graduated from Sisters High School and had those experience, and I have a sophomore there currently. So it's a unique community, a lot of support, a lot of value in education, and those partnerships pay off. We have partnerships with our local science club, Roundhouse Foundation. We have a graduate resource organization that raises a lot of money to get kids scholarships each year that we just celebrated. Our folk festival, music and arts partnerships with the folk festival. It's a really strong, unique place. That being said, we have a lot of similar challenges. Our demographics, we are 92% white. We might speak 5 languages. We lost a Russian kid, so maybe we're down to 4. So we have different issues than others. Our biggest issue is our special education. Our biggest demographic subgroup would be special education and the challenges of our students with learning disabilities, and then our economically disadvantaged, which is rising as well. We experience the same challenges for housing and supporting staff. We're actually, we invested this year in a partnership with the University of Oregon to look at sustained housing and how do we do that. We're at the very front end of that discussion. It's looking at other models. There's a school district in San Francisco that actually bought an entire apartment complex on a public bond. So they got around some of the necessities of the fair housing requirements, where if we create subsidized housing, we have to offer it to all, not just our employees, depending on how you structure that. So there's a lot of hurdles in those processes. I'd love to say that we could just afford to pay our people more. Unfortunately, we have even with our local option and benefiting from that, we have a restricted funding source from the state that we just can't do that without impacting a lot of other factors in our budget. Our size, we have a general fund above about 20 million from the state is what we get. We were, so compared to the 200 million that Steve was talking about, we're much smaller. Our community has supported 2 construction bonds since I've been in Sisters. I'm finishing up my 8th year. In my first year, we were fortunate to pass a bond to improve security and safety in schools and do some deferred maintenance. And this last, 2 years ago, we passed rolled our high school bond over to be able to build a new elementary school. So we are going from a 43,000 square foot K4 elementary to a 80,000 square foot K5 elementary school. So let's see, the other challenges. We too have more dysregulated students. Dysregulated, so some challenging students. I'm not sure, I don't like to use violent because, when kids flip their lids, as we call it, sometimes they don't realize what they're doing, so we like to refer to them in that way. The small class sizes really help. We have also instituted a program in our elementary school based on Stephen Covey's work called Leader in Me, which helps. It's kind of a process of these pillars that help kids kind of re-regulate, right? Recognize when they have triggers and self-regulate as they move through. We're just starting in that work. I do believe, as Charan alluded to, not completely a symptom of COVID, but definitely COVID was an accelerator. I think if you look at the research around the impact of electronic devices on youth and their development, their social skills. So whether it's parenting by iPad and what happens in the impact of that, and then the acceleration of social isolation with COVID, we're seeing rising incidents of those behaviors in our school. And I hate to say it, we were able to stay in, we met the requirements. Our elementary school was in 4 days a week, full days for the kids that were there that chose to be live in school. And so we were fortunate in that regard, but we're still seeing the impact on the rest of our students who were there every other day, following the protocol set forth. It was not the optimal way to serve kids and educate them, but it's what we had to do during the pandemic. And where I'm going with that is, even though this June the pandemic is over, the impact is still there, right? So we're still serving kids who have less social ability, who lost academic skills, and that we're still in the process of trying to recover that for those students. So I know we all talked about running out of ESSER dollars and the impact on our budgets. We're still serving kids with deficits developed through that pandemic. So that's another challenge that I think that we are seeing. Actually, I think we pretty much covered it, so I'm going to stop there, and I think it's better for the question and answer than me droning on up here. So, thank you.
I have a long list of questions. I'm not going to ask those questions. I'm going to turn those over to the audience. I know that many of you submitted questions beforehand. So one thing I would ask is whenever you have a question, let us know if you're addressing it to the entire panel or to a specific superintendent. And since I know there are so many questions in the audience, please ask one question and let the other audience members ask questions before you ask additional questions. And then if we have a lull at some point, please ask whatever additional questions you might have. So you can either ask a question from your seat, or if you would like to have the mic, feel free to walk up to the mic. Carol?
Hi, I know that you know that we did forums for the school board, and the community of sisters actually had the most viewers. So my question to you is, how can we engage the community into understanding how important it is to select qualified school board members, and how can we work together to do that in the next special election?
School board races are interesting. Should I get back up to the microphone?
Yeah.
It happens to me all the time.
So, school board races are an interesting dilemma, the changing scenescape that we're talking about. So 8 years ago, when I came to Sisters, people got on the ballot, wrote a few letters. That there really wasn't a, campaign page, a pack for board members. Being as small as we are, that was more of a Bend phenomenon, not necessarily a Sisters phenomenon. That dynamic has changed, and I think reading the political scenescape, that seems to be a portion of it. So we always encourage our public to try to be as involved as possible and educated on the issues, including the school board members that they're voting for and what they stand for, their history. It's a little bit interesting as a superintendent. The school boards are our bosses, to be up here talking about that process. I do trust the process. We believe that we have, at least I'll speak for my community, an educated, affluent community that understands the importance of being involved. They've shown that to us time and time again. So we really have to be hands-off in those processes because of the regulations that guide us. And so we kind of sit off to the side and watch the activity and trust that our community will self-educate and understand what the candidates stand for, what they represent, how they will support the community. But it's become more, I think I don't know that Jeff did, but I know our other candidate had to form a PAC, had to do a whole campaign of signs and an online presence as well to keep up with other candidates that were doing similar things. That was new to the community of the Sisters, at least, and that usually it was a very grassroots letter writing campaign to the editor or interviews by the local paper to get the information out. And so that was a new one for us in Sisters. But I do believe our folks, at least in our community, are very educated and will work to find the right person to support the system. And we trust the process, and so I still think it is representation of the community, and so trust the process. And if someone I don't agree with gets elected, it's because the community elected them, right? Or maybe we don't see, I shouldn't say agree with, that we don't have the same value set or see things in a different perspective. They were voted in and elected by the community, and we've got to work together to support our kids and work forward and find a common ground to do just that. So I think I've answered the question. I'm going to step away.
The school board races have become a bit of a political show that they didn't used to be, for sure, and it's interesting with that. I think one of the fundamental problems with school boards, well, that's not true. It's the fundamental problem how people perceive school boards, is that people don't understand what school boards do, and that's a big problem. And so, in terms of what you can do to help, trying to educate people on what school boards do and what their role is extraordinarily important, because most people think of the school board as some kind of legislative body. They get together, they think about rules, they come up with laws, they develop policy. Not at all. School boards themselves are actually part of the executive branch. They're part of actually executing the laws. Legislature makes the laws. The governor is actually the superintendent of public instruction in the state of Oregon. And so as the laws come down from the school and the state board of education, the legislature, the state board of education, and those come down, our job is to then create policies to teach people how to execute them. So administrators and teachers, as they're working with students and developing schools and running things, know how to make them work. People come to the board, though, with the idea that they can change it all. They can make laws, not understanding that school districts are about the most regulated thing on the planet. We have state laws, we have local laws, we have federal laws, we have court decisions. We have this wild mess of legislation that governs what we do and how we do it, and everything we do. And then we work with textbooks manufacturers, and we have lots of partners in the community and stuff. We are fundamentally an organization is there to educate children. That's our job. And really over the last, I would say 20 years, we've become even more social service organizations where we're not just educating kids, but we're taking care of them. We're working on their mental health, we're working on their physical health, we're working with parents. And so, again, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what people think a school board does. So helping people understand that and asking questions about what we actually do, promoting people that would like to help us run a better school system and connect well with our community is really the way to go. When folks come to a school board because they want to make some kind of political points, what they find, they're very disappointed and very frustrated very quickly, because that's not what we actually do at a school district. Thank you.
This question. I think the first thing to say is that school districts that are running reasonably smoothly, that bodes well for incumbency. And when you talk about engagement, you talk about people that are going to figure out who they're going to vote for. I go back to my kids, my 34, 33, and 29-year-old. Not one of them owns cable. Not one of them gets their news from most of us, I would say, and most of us old people get it from. They don't think about CBS, ABC, CNN. They don't think about any of that. They're getting it directly off of apps, and I can tell you which ones if you care to know. That's their engagement. And so when you talk about how do you engage with a school board election in a community, I think that's the pulse of what we're trying to find out. And it's not just about elections for school boards, it's everything. We begged for parents, we begged for community members, come into our schools, volunteer for us. I was kidding, but I wasn't kidding, come sub for us. Any of you that want to come walk with me in a school, call me. Well, you can come with me and I can show you fantastic things that are going on. So when you ask me about engagement, the answer that I struggle with is the same that we all are struggling with, is what's the best means to get people to listen to us when we say, here's what we need to talk about. And I think it's no different. I've done this now in 4 states, and when I saw the voters pamphlet here, never had a voters pamphlet before I got to Oregon. I was like, oh, my God, what a great resource. And my kids didn't even ask me who to vote for, right? Like, they're like, hey, I know what I'm gonna do. And so that to me is how are you engaging with your community? And so I think I would throw it back to you. How are we staying relevant with generations below us that are doing things a whole lot differently than we are?
Next question, please.
Yeah, I live in Bend, so this is for Steve, but you guys can answer also. Housing, of course, you mentioned is primo, the problem that we're facing right now. What steps are you taking in the background as far as lobbying for more building or for affordable housing? What steps is Ben Lapine Schools doing to try and get more housing?
So there's three things that come to mind right off the bat. The first one is I scream at our legislators, give us more money. And honestly, and it isn't thanks to Steve Cook, but going from we said originally, we all belong to a group of statewide administrators, and we said 10.3 is what it's going to take to 10.3 billion is what it's going to take for us to be able to maintain status quo. What does that mean? That means continuing on the same path we're on, not cutting jobs, continuing with the programming that we're at. So when they came out with 9.9, we said that's not status quo. We need more money. We need, if you want to give us more money, go to the QEM model, which is what, 11.4? 11.9. We're just trying to get the resources to number one so that we can, and 85% of our budgets, give or take a percent or two, go to people. And almost all of our costs are invested in the cost of educators, EAs, support staff. Almost all of that goes to those people. So that's the first one. The second one is all of us are somewhat of commercial developers right now. We have 2 pieces of land that we're floating around with different developers looking for a partner to help us build affordable housing on these 2 pieces of land that we have. Looking for ways that we can, nobody wants to do this for free. So you've got to make it sustainable. And that's part of what we're trying to accomplish. These 2 pieces of ground could have very substantial infrastructure and investments put on them. And how long that's going to take, it's going to happen. I don't know how long it's going to take, but it will happen. And I think the third one is partnering with the city. There's a program out now. We call it the MUPTI program, multi-use something. Anyway, affordable housing programs in which they need to go to all the taxing districts to get permission to build those things. And our goal is to, number one, increase the amount of affordable housing units in the district, in the entire community. For us, remember, it's Ben Lapine. So we're working across 1,600 square miles, not just the city of Bend proper. And we're seeing growth in Lapine because of the cost of housing in Bend. We're actually growing enrollment in Lapine because of what's going on here. And much unlike, I think it was Kurt that said that their poverty level is increasing, ours is decreasing. Before the pandemic, we would average about 45% free and reduced lunch count, which is, they used to be the major factor of free and reduced lunch count. Of localized poverty calculations. We're now, post-pandemic, somewhere in the high 20s. And when you ask why, logically, there's really only one answer to that, and the fact that people that can't afford to live here are leaving, and those houses are being scooped up by people that can't afford to live here. And so that's when you do the math on that, and a district our size, we're the 5th largest district in the state, to see that dramatic of a change over that short of a period of time. We were at 18.7, I wasn't here, but 18,700 students right before the pandemic. Now we're in that 17.5, 17.6 range. That's a churn of people. And so the people that can't afford to stay are leaving. And so how do we maintain, how do we keep housing prices down? That's a volume issue. Those 3 programs are 3 examples of ways that we can contribute to that. We've also got programming on McKinney-Vento programming that supports homeless students, and we have millions of dollars that are committed to keeping those students supported in our community. The other one here that's a local secret that no one outside of the state of Oregon knows about, Fan Advocacy Network, is insanely, if you have a bucket of money you just want to give away, give it to Fan. That is a group that takes care of our most needy students in all of our communities. And so anything we can do to support them, we should take that opportunity.
What's their name?
The Fan Advocacy Network, FAN. You see their site, FAN, and they're doing fantastic things for all of Central Oregon.
We almost have, almost every school has a fan coordinator that connects with us. Yeah, it's a really great program.
I don't want to talk long on it, but one thing I do want to correct. So our numbers are also reducing. The point that I made earlier is our low SES group is one of our largest demographic subgroups. It's not increasing, it's actually decreasing as well. So we're seeing the same impact in our community and the same challenges as far as affordable housing, cost of living. We have, I think we were number one in the state for teacher retention, 16 plus years. So most of our folks are veteran teachers, and they are far down the pay scale. So they can, to some degree, afford, but in the last 3 years, I think, Jeff, we looked at the last decade. So Jeff Smith's one of our board members who's here today. We were in the past decade, according to Portland State, I think we were the fastest growing community in the state. Sisters is small. It's an interesting dichotomy that people who moved here 5 years ago want the growth to stop, right? So they might be, it's amazing, we were at a community forum and the number of people that stood up that had moved to Sisters in the last 5 years was most of the people, but they were the most vocal about stop building. So it's an interesting dichotomy. And for us, speaking to some degree for schools and even communities, if you're not growing, if you're going the other way, our funding is two things: the state and the roll-up budget and what they give us that way, but it's also more kids. So the more kids that we have, the more ability we have to give special programming to our kids and community and keep that going. What we've seen is also typically strong schools equal a strong desire to move in. The pandemic for us, we saw a lot of folks that could telecommute, and so we went from an interesting demographic of our high school. When I started, was our biggest school at 470. It's not our biggest school anymore. So even though we've continued growing, the interesting part of our growth is that our elementary school, our K4, is our biggest school now at 404 kids, and our high school's at 395. So we've gotten bigger, but bigger with younger families. So professionals that can afford to telecommute and live in a community and choose a community, we believe, are choosing Sisters because of special programming, strong community partnerships. It is a great size. You don't get lost. And we have strong school systems. So anyway, so I'll
You don't get lost.
Well, lost. We still get lost. Yeah, I don't know if you get lost there, but you can't get across the road.
That's
go right.
always go right.
Well, let's see. In terms of teacher housing, we have not yet started to explore the idea of building for our district. Although we are looking at land use studies right now, we're kind of looking through it. We are also sitting on a couple pieces of property, or they're asking the question: do we need to save these for future growth for schools, or do we need to think about doing some teacher housing? I do have the advantage in the situation, who I happen to be married to the housing coordinator in Redmond, and so I have a good sense of what is coming up and what's happening in terms of work. Redmond in itself is growing. It's really working on its economic development team, of which I'm part of, really is working on bringing in new businesses, bringing in folks, bringing in small manufacturers, expanding what we do, diversifying the economy there. And that continues to bring people in. Lots of small manufacturers, but it brings people in, and we have a community-wide problem on housing. The city of Redmond is doing a ton of work on this. Maybe you've heard about the North Point Vista project, which is a project that's going to go outside of outside of Redmond. It'll be about 450 units. And some of those will be low income, some will be market rate, and some of those will be workforce housing, what they call it. And that workforce housing is kind of shooting at the demographic of what we're talking about today. Really, as they like to say, as they say at the city of Redmond, aiming at teachers and nurses, kind of that demographic of work. And so there's lots of those kind of projects going on. There's lots of that work. It takes quite a bit of time to develop low-income housing, to develop workforce housing. It doesn't pay for builders, and so they've got to have incentives to make it happen, right? Lots of different interesting things happening with all that stuff all over Redmond, and not just for schools, really for the expansion of the businesses generally. And how do you bring people in to work in these great businesses people are trying to start? How do you bring people into, how do you bring in really great teachers to move into Central Oregon, because it's a great place to live and people don't tend to leave once they're here, but how do we give them an opportunity to afford it? When I moved over, I was in the McMinnville area before I came over here, and I sold my house. I made a good profit, and I thought, oh, I'll come over and buy something here, only to find out that things were 30% higher here than they were in the middle of wine country, McMinnville, and that was a shocking experience for me. And so it's an interesting problem as we're trying to attract talent, because people do want to live here. It's a great place to live. Our district is not getting less poor. In fact, when we work with Neighbor Impact to develop Head Start programs in schools, and they tell me that there are not enough kids in Bend to fill the Head Start programs they currently have, and they're thinking about shutting those down. On the other hand, the need for that in Redmond is growing dramatically. We'll partner with them to open 3 Head Start programs in various elementary schools next year. And this is part of using our new projects that we just built with our bond dollars, which we put in for security and renovations, and have added 12 classrooms into the district. It's really important work. However, the idea of how do you make it attractive, how do you make it a great place for people to live, it is a multi-stage process. It's complicated, it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of players. The biggest thing is building good partnerships with businesses, good partnership with your local governments, with your housing, connecting with folks all the time to kind of really plan for the future, that long term. This is a question that's about the next 15 years, and how do we make that happen over time? And so we have to really look at that data. What are we looking at? What do we need? What is it that people are willing to support and afford? We're going to look at running another bond campaign in 24 to replace some aging structures that we have, and we're going to ask those questions as part of the surveys. What is it that people support? What is it that you feel as a community is important for the Redmond School District to go forward? So, thanks.
I want to qualify something for all 3 of us. I don't want anybody leaving here thinking that we don't have students living in poverty. We have abject, generational poverty in our schools, and while there's a lot of affluence in Central Oregon, and there are a lot of kids living in houses that many of us couldn't even begin to hope to afford. We have kids living with dirt floors. We have kids that don't have running water in all 3 of our districts. And so when I talk about like the Fan Advocacy Network, that's who those kids are supporting. I mean, those are the kids who that network is supporting. And so just want to make sure that there's not a misunderstanding on what kids are walking through the door that are coming into our schools.
My general question really has to do with how important in the curriculum of our educational system focuses on civics. I think a lot of us have heard phrases like dumbing down of America. There was a survey done years ago that found that almost half the people in Oregon that were surveyed in a scientific survey didn't know we had 2 US senators. There's the relatively low percentage of young people that don't vote compared to senior citizens. There's a lot of confusion about climate change and government regulations and other things that most of us that pay attention don't find controversial. They're just facts and science. I'm just wondering, how important is that in the curriculum, and how are young people reacting to the news of the happenings in our current events?
I'll take the time to go first here, just since I have it. Yeah, these are challenging questions, and definitely part of the issues. I can tell you in terms of civics, we teach civics constantly at every grade level. High school level, it's 3 out of 4 years. Different parts of the social sciences. I'm a social studies teacher myself, so I work through that. Part of what we deal with in America is a lot of competing narratives. Of what people are paying attention to. I think that our biggest problem in schools, well, maybe not our biggest problem, but a problem we have in schools is all the distractions, if you will, that all of our children have. You've got everything from kids who are at school, who live in the junipers, as we like to say in Redmond, who are homeless, really are much more interested in eating than they are in worried about U.S. history. We have students with us that are really focused on getting a football scholarship, and that's kind of what they're thinking about. And we have students with us that want to go to college, and students with us that are ready to go out and work on the manufacturing floors. We have people with lots of different competing interests. Now, we teach them all, and we work through them, and we're always teaching folks. What people walk away from sometimes has a lot to do with what's relevant for them and what's relevant for the information in their lives. When you've got a kid who is relatively well fed and relatively taken care of well and lives comfortably, I would say that student tends to retain a lot of the information that we give them and put those into place. But American society is not that way. American society has a really wide range of wealth gaps, if you will, and people come from lots of different areas. And so it really depends on how it connects to them and as they work through it. So I don't know if that answers your question correctly, but the truth is that for us to be one society and for us to continue to have this multi-group of cultures in the United States, we're trying to meld ourselves into one nation, which is a continuous issue. It has been for 250 years, right? Of how do we, as lots of different groups of people, become one group of people? And part of the public schools' charge is to help with that, is to help create that common base of knowledge. But what you see right now in our society is that people are resisting the common base of knowledge. You've got people who are either focused on social media, as Steve talked about with his kids, and I can talk about with my own kids, and you've got folks that are much more interested in whatever their organization is telling them, right? And so lots of different points of information. It's a tough environment for schools to work in because almost anything we tell people, somebody disagrees with it, whether or not, as we put it out there, so. Okay.
I would agree with Charan as well. So we teach social studies, civics, U.S. history. We teach those at various levels. What I would urge people is to also get involved at the legislative level. I've spent my past year probably more time arguing about why we have required PE minutes for our elementary kiddos and middle school kiddos, and we don't have required minutes in any other core subject, right? So part of it is what the legislature does. They reducing or only requiring 2 credits of social studies for graduation means that you may not get a full litany of courses. When I went through, we got U.S. history, civics, government, we got personal finance. We had a bigger variety that we were able to take that I think are critical for kids and their success. Now some of them are more embedded because the standards haven't gone away, but the credit requirement has been reduced since back in the day. So I would say my urging would be for people to talk to your legislators. There are requirements that the state sets that kind of, again, if we're spending our time on people and one of our guidebooks are the credits required for graduation, then that also we hire so many people to make sure we cover those requirements as we move through. And honestly, typically when they don't become required anymore, we tend to spend less time. And I'd like to go back to that first example I used. We have tried to resist the PE mandate because it would require us to hire more PE teachers. So at elementary school level, they cover our general ed teachers' prep times. So the specialists cover the prep time. So we currently have PE, music, art, and STEM that are preps. If we had to hire more PE teachers, so we would have to eliminate one of those other positions, which we think is important for a well-rounded education for our elementary kids to start thinking, being critical thinkers, explore more of the world that way. And so we've actually embedded many of our PE minutes into our other class times because there's standards that you can follow, and as long as we do a school-wide PD on what that looks like. So from my lens, it would start at that top level of really influencing our state leaders and what's required through the school system is an important piece of that puzzle.
I'm going to take a little different angle on this. I'm going to actually go kind of in a more positive direction in the fact that we're expanding the social studies standards in the state of Oregon. And in fact, a complete revision of the state standards are just on the fringe next 24, 25, 25, 26. And what we're going to see are a lot more of the history of our country that wasn't necessarily written by people that look like us in this room. And that's starting to bubble into our educational system right now. It's in our classrooms and in all of our districts, not just Ben Lapine, but in all of our districts. The fact that there are things that weren't being taught, like the Tulsa Massacre and all of those kinds of issues that we are now drawing to in a very child-centric way, K through 12, appropriately developed so that it is being nurtured in that process. That's a powerful, I want you to also hear me say, we're in good hands. The kids coming out today are so much better human beings than we are, folks. They are doing a good job at being on their path to being adults.
And I want to agree with that. We graduate kids that are more qualified, smarter, better prepared than we ever have. Really do. Stop there.
One of the things that we used to hear a lot of, and I haven't heard much in this conversation today, was what percentage of your budget is PERS obligations, and how does that impact you one way or the other? And the second is, and I think we're on the fringes of what that question was, and that is, how are you guys dealing with the culture wars within your districts? For example, you talked about the Tulsa Massacre, otherwise known in many circles as CRT.
Oh, Steve's back up.
I want to go first, so they have to follow. Okay, so first question, the PERS, quite honestly, PERS is the state retirement system.
Public Employees Retirement System.
And so I'll be honest, I give it zero thought because it's out of my control. It's totally out of my control. I think Charan might have a little different aspect on this, because one of the things that districts across the state do, some district pick up the contribution that the employer, all of the employers have to pay this contribution, whatever it is, 22%, something like that. Some districts also pay the employee's contribution. Not all districts do that, and that's a real thing, because that's what 6%
Yeah.
difference in pay just on that aspect. And so the answer to the first part of your question is, what I have to do is figure out how much is it going up each biennium. We have to put that in the budget right off the bat, and then we work from there. And so I don't lose sleep over it. I just ask for more money when we're talking with legislators every time. You guys know Emerson Levy, Jason Croft. Tell them Steve wants more money. The second part, this is a unique conversation because it depends on where you're at, right? For us in Ben Lapine, it bends one way. It bends another way in Redmond. It bends another way in Sisters. It bends even another way in Crook County. It just depends on where you are and how that culture war plays out. I have had conversations with hundreds of people in the last 2 years about the culture wars or the lack thereof. And I have said, come with me, let's go. I invite anybody into our schools. You tell me what you're seeing. You tell me where you see and hear indoctrination. Let's go talk about it. And I've met with groups of people. I've met with folks who just want to grind an axe with me, and I'll talk with them and I email them, and I write every email I write, knowing it's probably going on Facebook, and just know what I want to make sure that's what's going to be the way it's reported. And so it's a conversation that we have to be prepared for. It's triggering those letters when you hear CRT. It means something to everybody. And so what I ask them to tell me more specifically is, what are you talking about? So we can get to that's really hard and nebulous to talk about. But if you can tell me something specific you want to talk about. I heard about a thing where a teacher told a kid to tell them their pronouns or something like that. Well, let's talk about that then, rather than this kind of nebulous, like that's just, it's rhetoric, and I don't, it's hyperbolic, all those things. I want to solve real problems, and I engage with anybody that want to help those conversations.
Yeah, CRT is probably one of them as we go through that, right? It's influencing groups of people to think a certain way. I remember the first time I got an email on CRT. I had to look it up. I didn't know what that was. I was like, what the heck is CRT? I had to go look it and Google it and go through it and go, oh, it's this academic thing talking about how race influences history and influences economics. You know, and I got thinking about it, like, oh, well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, and it would go through it. It is an actually important part of people's college work, thinking about how race, how those things have impacted folks. I mean, for people to say that race hasn't impacted history, I would ask the question, why then do we have Indian reservations? I mean, there's all kinds of reasons out there. There's all kinds of things when we talk about stuff. I think that U.S. history is an evolving subject. People like to teach it as if things happened this way, right? As like there's narrative. There's narratives to it. Back when I was a social studies teacher, I used to have a quote on the wall. It was my favorite quote. It was from Napoleon Bonaparte, of all people, and it said, "History is an agreed upon myth." And it was really the idea as that people tell stories of what happened in the past for the outcome they want now. Okay? And so what you've got is lots of people telling different stories for the outcome they want people to have now. Because there are 10,000 stories, millions of stories about the things that happen to people in our country and every other country over time, right? So we tend to teach a fairly standard narrative of U.S. history and world history as we go through that. I would say it is still a pretty European-focused area. As Steve was talking about, the new standards are coming out. We're beginning to bring other points of view in, other points of view of how other people feel about what happened. How did other people feel about? I mean, I've my wife's family were on the Oregon Trail. They came over here for a long period of time. They're settlers. They're pioneers. Their families are enshrined in places all over the Willamette Valley. And from their point of view, that was a good thing. For the point of view of the people who were already living here, that wasn't a good thing, right? And so acknowledging what happened, I mean, the cherished parts of our history is important. Now, I'll tell you, in high schools, they don't dig into it very deep. And I would say that as we look at it, as we talk about it, students are beginning to become exposed to these other points of stories. But as they get into more of their own studies, it digs in deeper. But people like to create issues around that because everybody's creating a narrative, something that they want to happen. I don't know if I've answered that question very well, but I'm answering from a social studies teacher's point of view. So I like debate. I like debate as we work through this stuff. So PERS, real quick on that. We do about 30% of our 30% of our wages or our benefits is PERS. It's an expensive part of the work. As Steve said, there's not a lot we can do about it. Although the Redmond School District just did a year and a half ago, just bonded all of our PERS debt, about $70 million. So we put that out for a bond, and so we were able to really lower our rates, which means that it used to be that PERS rates would jump up a percentage or two every year. You'd have to account for it. So we've been able to manage our PERS rates to kind of keep them pretty steady. And so because of that, because we've worked on that, now our PERS rates go up, less than 1% each year as we're working through that. And so it's a lot of money out there. It's a lot of liability on the district. When we pass a bond, for instance, and we bring in Moody's to evaluate our district economically, how we're doing, they look at that. They look at what is your financial burden in terms of your retirement work and all that. But as Steve said, it's just kind of baked in as part of what we do. If at some point the PERS burden goes away, we'll have a lot more money for classrooms, and that'd be exciting. But then, of course, our employees aren't taken care of as well as they start to move out of their careers. So.
I'll start with the PERS conversation since that's where Charan ended, just for some consistency. I would agree it's really just a part of what we calculate now for business. And do we like that it's a large chunk? No. I would agree with Charan. I think back when I started, PERS was a recruiting tool. Right? You knew there was a robust retirement system. You knew your salary wasn't great as a public educator, but you had a robust retirement system that supported you in the tail end. And I would also say that I don't want to get too much of a birdwalk onto health insurance benefit, because if you're asking me, that's probably one of the biggest drivers right now, maybe even more so than PERS, is what we pay for healthcare coverage for employees and what that actually gives them for coverage, which is, I have 4 kids. My first one I didn't pay for because the insurance covered it. And that changed over the span of us having kids and where we are now. So for me, I think healthcare is probably a bigger hot button issue than PERS on the system. I think I heard a number once that with the PERS reforms, we're looking at 2032 being the real tipping point for the benefit of the reform. Whether that actually is the case, what we're seeing now is more people, because of where the economy is, retiring and contracting back, which it helps because we're paying down the unfunded liability. We still pay load on them. That's one of the reforms. So we're seeing some benefit in PERS rates, but again, don't spend a lot of time because it's just baked into it. Spend more time worrying about insurance and the cost there and the coverage and its impact on our ability to recruit staff because of our pay. So that's the other piece. And then I would just echo the piece about CRT. The first time I heard it, the same thing, I had to look it up and see what it was. When we teach about incidents, whether it's the Trail of Tears or slavery, right? Should we look at perspectives of not only the white settlers, but also the natives who are being moved, right? That's looking at perspective and having our students make their own judgments. If that's CRT, then, I guess we do that because we want our kids to understand both sides of what that means. And I'd say, being a history major as well, that we're talking 5,000 years of history where people were at war and dislocated and moved and enslaved and et cetera, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. But we want them to have people to have an understanding of what that means, what's the impact. I would share the story that I think is something we don't talk about enough, and I'll go back to our SES conversation. So I'll use a personal story. My wife probably could have her Cherokee Native American identification card, but doesn't. She's never identified that way, and it was more because of affluence. Family relocated. Great-great-great-grandfather was on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Then her grandmother and grandfather relocated from Oklahoma to Oregon. They've owned their own businesses, made a good living, done well. She's never identified it as a part of her native heritage, whether that's, she assimilated, whatever, if we want to go back to some of those terms. However, the point of the story is, educationally, the cutting line of success and not success is not based on race, it's based on income. If you look across our nation, regardless of the kids that struggle, it's income, right? So it's poor Black kids, poor Latino kids, poor Native kids, poor white kids. Poor is where we need to support our students across the board. And we still have race-based issues in our schools that we need to resolve. Still 100% racism is there, 100%, it's still out there. But if we're looking at access to education, economics is the biggest influence right now.
We didn't follow directions.
Okay, we're at almost 10 after 1. And I know that you all are very busy. Would you want to take one more question, or we can stop here and people can email you with any additional questions? Okay, let's respect their time. They're very busy people. They were very generous with their time. I know we can ask questions all afternoon. This group is full of questions. We could be here till 5 p.m. and we would love to talk with you. But I appreciate your taking your time to speak with us today, to field lots of different kinds of questions. We really enjoyed the dialogue. And I would like to thank all of you for the work that you've done through the pandemic, steering the school systems through the pandemic, and being at the in the firestorm of the cultural wars and dealing with everything that you're dealing with. So I really appreciate the work that you do, and I know that this audience appreciates you as well. At this point, I'd like to thank you all for attending First Thursdays through the last year, voting on surveys, deciding what you wanted to see presented, suggesting that we even have a panel of superintendents from throughout Deschutes County. So our next First